Hello and welcome to another edition of On the Line, Perspectives on Partition with me, Paul McFadden. This series, which is organised by the Bloody Sunday Trust, invites people from diverse backgrounds to share their thoughts on one of the defining events in modern Irish history, the partition of the island 100 years ago, and to give us our views as well on things which have come to pass in the century since then. Our guest today was one of the island's best known contributors to the Brexit debate, which, to be honest, has the feel of a work in progress. He is a Fine Gael member of Dáil Éireann for the Dublin Rathdown constituency. Deputy Neale Richmond, you're very welcome to the series, first of all. Thanks for agreeing to come and join this conversation, which I suspect, by the way, is the kind of conversation you've been having with many people the length and breadth of the island in recent months, maybe even years, but we'll pursue all of that in a moment. In these conversations, I've kind of tended to start with people about sort of more up-to-date things, but I want to get right to the subject matter of the series, really, the event itself, Partition, because your party, Fine Gael, very much owes its origins to that whole debate about the national question. So at a century's remove, 100 years on from the actual event itself, how do you look back on Partition?
Well, it's evolved, Paul, so much over the century, and even though Fine Gael has its origin in the pro-treaty side of the Civil War, which of course brought about partition, a lot of people forget that the name of the party is Fine Gael, the United Ireland Party.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that it's reflective of the vast majority of political opinion in the South, and has been consistently. And at various stages throughout the century, talking about partition had various different connotations, and it was reflective of the times we were in. And certainly the conversations we'd have today would have been very different than 30 years ago, would have been very different than 50 or 60 years ago, and very different to partition itself when it came about after the treaty. And look, I'm a lover of history, I'm a student of history. When you look at what went in, many people would argue that there wasn't as much attention paid in the treaty debates to partition than there was, say, about the Oath of Allegiance. And one thing that I've certainly in this past couple of months, when people have been talking about the centenary of partition, the centenary of the establishment in Northern Ireland, I've been lucky to do some reading and watch some programs, and we've had some presentations on, the history of Northern Ireland and the unionist voices who were quite happy with, partition, as well as the voices in Dublin, and indeed many people from the South, including many of my family members who sought refuge in Northern Ireland because they were concerned about what the Free State would be. But now we've moved, the conversation today is so much more different than it was then. The world is so much different. You can't compare 1922 to today, or 1921 to today. And it provides massive challenges today, but it also provides huge opportunities, and to have a very different tone of conversation.
Those forebears who sought refuge or sanctuary of a sort in Northern Ireland, what was it that they were frightened of in the new emerging Free State?
Well, there was many things. It was the old cliche used before that home rule was Rome rule. And we saw that in the early establishment of the Free State. And you look at De Valera's Constitution of 1937, where the Roman Catholic Church was given a very defined role in the life of the state. And indeed, that role continued really up until present day, with some positive consequences, but some very dark and disturbing consequences. And for a minority population, there was a feeling and a fear of retribution. We would have seen in parts of Ireland where houses were burnt down, where people felt that their jobs, be they in the military or the civil service, or the privileges they'd been granted by pre-existing laws, were being removed. And many of them saw opportunities in the north, but equally in Great Britain or in Canada or America. And I think it was at one stage, my late parents were the only ones of their family, in terms of siblings and first cousins, who lived in the state. All the others had gone to England or had gone up to Northern Ireland. And that was something that took a while to regularise. There was, now depending on who you talk to, there'd be certain people in the, I'd call it the British nationalist persuasion, or the unionist or loyalist persuasion, who say there was a pogrom of Southern Unionists or Southern Protestants. There wasn't. And many remained and made a very strong contribution to civic life. But there was cultural differences, and there was certain occasions when casual everyday sectarianism did exist. And I think those fears were real. But thankfully, we are in an era now where we have so much more of a diverse society that so many of those fears and indeed prejudices have been thankfully eased away. And to be honest, they're a sense of crack, or a source of crack and a bit of fun now as much as anything else, which is the way it should be.
But there is a lot of a lot of hurt in the past as well. Did your late parents ever regret the decision to remain in the state?
No, not for a moment. They were Irish. They really felt hurt when people would question their nationality, their patriotism based on their religion. And even my late grandparents, who all stayed south of what was the border, they would have never doubted their Irishness. Even my grandfather, who was a member of the Orange Order, he was still Irish, first and foremost. And he was still a member of the IFA and its forebears and everything else, and contributed to civic life, which is how it was. But there would have been occasions, small cultural things. I remember being in secondary school and there was an armistice service and we would have worn poppies, and I was going on to something and my mother made sure I took off my poppy because she was scared what would happen if you wore a poppy out and about. And you'd occasionally would have got comments at sporting matches, or things would have been seen as slightly unsavory. But again, that has, I would argue, has mellowed a lot, even just in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, when we talk about the very difficult decade of commemorations, how much progress towards reconciliation was made in a short time, be that the Taoiseach going up to Fermanagh for the armistice survey or service, or even Arlene Foster going to Clonus. It's those small steps, things that would have been thought of as unthinkable. But there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very honourable contribution made to that kind of movement, a very early contribution to it, in fact, by a predecessor of yours in Fine Gael. I'm thinking of the late Deputy Paddy Hart, just across the border from us here in Raphoe, who, along with the late Glenn Barr, in fact, and the work that they did in terms of the whole World War I commemoration, really were kind of pioneers in breaking down barriers and exploding maybe some of the misconceptions that existed across the community, one part of the community about another.
Yeah, and actually my godmother's from Ramelton, so she would always talk about that experience. And I think even on a contemporary basis, Frank Feehan, the now Minister for State, is a very close friend of mine, and Frank is from Boyle. His predecessors were IRA volunteers, but he talked about Boyle's role as a garrison town and how many young boys, to be honest, from Boyle went and fought on the Western Front in the Great War, and then for so long of our history we ignored it. And I can talk about, it would make sense for me to talk about having had relations, great uncles, great granduncles who would have gone from Cavan to fight on the Western Front. Some in Gallipoli, one was actually on the RMS Leinster as it was sunk leaving Dunleary Harbour. But when Frankie was bringing it back to, well, actually the vast majority of the tens and tens of thousands of Irish men and boys who went to fight in the Great War did so for a whole combination of reasons. And then again, many who went to fight in the Second World War as well. And it took a long time, but there was and I was really struck actually about 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been 3 years ago, on the anniversary of the end of the Great War, there was a ceremony in Westminster. I wasn't a member of the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, but Sean Crowe, Sinn Féin TD in the constituency beside mine, Dublin South West, he's from Dundrum, where I'm from originally, laid a laurel wreath in the Hall of Westminster. And I just thought that was very significant, no more than Queen Elizabeth of England laying a wreath at the Garden of Remembrance. And it's all those sort of small things, respecting people's heritage, the pain people may have suffered. And time allows that to be a lot easier. And I think that's why we're able to have conversations now that people would have maybe shied away from 20, 30 years ago, wouldn't have necessarily been as informed about. And that's a good thing, but there's a lot more conversations to have. And it's as long as we approach them in the right manner, it's not always a contest, it's not always an argument, and it's perfectly okay to disagree with someone on a point of principle and then go for a cup of tea with them and have the crack. But that's politics around the world. But certainly on our small island, it's the present day challenge as much as it has been ever thus.
You're talking about all the small things. I want to cut right to two of the big things. One pretty much bang up to date, the other historical. Your thoughts on the actual act of partition? Good thing, bad thing, beneficial, disastrous? What are your views now, 100 years after the actual event itself?
No, it wasn't a good thing. The division of our island wasn't a good thing. The division of our country wasn't a good thing. It led to a lot of hurt. It was at the source point of a lot of hurt, and it's led to an emotional and mental separation today that is unfortunate and unnecessary. And that's not necessarily an emotional separation between unionists in the north and nationalists or Republicans in the south. It's societal separation, north and south. You know, how many people from Waterford have gone up to the North Antrim coast for their holidays? How many people from the south just visit the north? How many people, including relations of mine, never come to the south, never spend euros? They only come down to go to the airport or to a family occasion, a funeral or a wedding. And that lack of integration, I think, it's sad in so many regards, but it's also a huge hindrance to the development of the country in terms of economic opportunities, social opportunities, the provision of services, our ability in football, you know, all those things. You can render it down to the big things, to the little things. So a century on, I can understand why partition happened. And I wasn't there, and Lord knows what my politics would have been in 1921. My politics, you know, I didn't come from a party political family. My father would have voted for a number of parties and politicians. My mother probably would have been a Fine Gael person, but you know, I was the first member of my family to get politically active. And the history of Fine Gael certainly attracted me in some regards, some of the people who'd been through Fine Gael. But it was the contemporary Fine Gael, even though I joined the party in 2002 when we just had a bit of a hammer in an election, it was contemporary Fine Gael and the future they were talking about that excited me and got me hooked on politics to the position today, where I've gone from just being a happy, you know, first-time member dropping leaflets to now being having the huge privilege and honour of sitting in the All Ireland.
That exciting future became a whole lot more exciting, but possibly for all the wrong reasons. Very recently, we had to vote for Brexit, and you have this one massive seismic political change 100 years ago. We have another one then, just a few years ago, people in the UK voting to leave the European Union. It's something that brought you very much to the fore into people's homes, you know, living rooms in the north here, as a result of your many contributions to news programs in Britain about the subject of Brexit. How I mean, you're not a fan of Brexit, obviously, but how catastrophic a decision was that, in your opinion?
Again, I'll start with the emotional. It was a very sad decision. You know, any divorce is sad, even if it's for the right reasons, and that's what Brexit was. It was a divorce. I'm a big believer in the European process. Always have been. It's one of the things that attracted to me Fine Gael, historically the most pro-European party with people like Gareth Fitzgerald and John Bruton at the helm. But the problem with Brexit is that people voted for a concept, but they never voted for an actuality. So Brexit happened, the vote happened, and then 5 years was spent trying to pick together with what it meant. What is Brexit? And all the different versions have spat out a version of Brexit now, which a lot of people aren't happy with, particularly not in Northern Ireland. And I was always going to, as a senator, I was in the Senate maybe 3 or 4 months before the referendum took place, and with an eye to do a lot of work on European issues. We expected the Brexit referendum to take place, for it to be defeated, and us to go back to talking about, you know, the future of Europe and CAP reform and Horizon 2020 and the new Green Deal. But I was lucky that I've had a lot of experience working within the EU and being a member of European bodies politically and professionally. I also have a huge fascination in British politics and the British political system. and a huge emotional and practical attachment to the north of our country as well. And anytime I was fortunate to spend time in Northern Ireland or go on Northern Irish media or write in Northern Irish newspapers, it was always it was more than just going through the motions to talk about an issue that is in your brief. It's something I felt a real connection with, and something that I was really motivated to give it my all and make myself available for whatever group that would meet me, whether they agreed with me or not. And I was lucky as a senator, you had the time to do those things. But it is a catastrophic decision, and the problem is the catastrophe is just being spun out to be something different. It's being hidden largely now by the pandemic. But the people who probably voted for Brexit will suffer the most, but they'll suffer the most without appreciating how much worse off they are. And yeah, and then the more material challenges, it could be as seismic for our island as partition 100 years ago. And I think it will lead to material change in due course.
How do you mean seismic in what way, Neil?
Well, I think ultimately Brexit will lead to us having a border poll very soon. And I think we have I think there will be a chance that a border poll could be called potentially earlier than some of us expect. And it could be called and it could be passed. And I say that, obviously that's something that I want to happen, but I want it to happen in the right way. And learning from Brexit, you need to be prepared. Absolutely, I aspire to see partition ended, but no one from a unionist community should be threatened by that. I'm not threatened by their unionism. I have no problem with them saying they want Northern Ireland to remain as part of the United Kingdom and this island to be partitioned. Good for you. If that's what you believe, sell it. I want to see a united Ireland, possibly different type of united Ireland than others who want to see united Ireland. But I think we probably wouldn't have been having these discussions if it wasn't for Brexit, because it exposed the very unique position of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. And I spent years bringing over political delegations from the continent to visit the border, spend a lot of time in very familiar hotels. I had more cups of tea in the Carrickdale with all types of characters from Germany and France and everything else, and visited lots of things. And their general opinion is, well, this doesn't really make sense. You say there's a border, but we can't see it and we can't feel it, which is good. But then those of us from this island can feel and see the border, even if it is an open border. And the fact that both Northern Ireland and the Republic were part of the European Union allowed the Good Friday Agreement process probably to speed up a lot quicker than continental comparisons. And I'm talking about when I speak with politicians from the former Soviet states in Eastern Europe, the satellite states from the Balkans, and even Germany. You know, they know what a really hard border looks like. And the frontiers of the European Union are really hard. Anyone who's ever tried to go from Poland into the Ukraine when the football was on knows that that's a border you're going to be there for a long time. And that's common. Whereas the nominal border on our island is, you can go across it 10 times without noticing, especially if you have your mobile phone off.
Things like, I mean, you've had this maybe a deeper interest kind of in the implications of Brexit than many of your colleagues in Dáil Éireann. Does any of the recrimination and the fallout from Brexit and the ensuing negotiation and the Northern Ireland Protocol, has any of that surprised you? Or, I mean, you were surprised, I think you were saying a moment ago, by the way the vote went in the UK, but given what's happened and what's transpired since, has any of that surprised you?
Not really, no. It's disappointed me, but it hasn't surprised me. Brexit's taken the wrong turn at every juncture. Bear in mind, the referendum was only passed marginally across the UK, defeated overwhelmingly in Scotland and Northern Ireland. There was no outreach for the leavers who wanted a soft Brexit. Bear in mind, Boris Johnson and Daniel Hannan always said the UK would remain in the single market. all that was ruled out so early. And what we saw over a period was a hardening of the type of Brexit, and a lot of the warnings that were dismissed as Project Fear either came to pass or nearly came to pass. And it was quite obvious that Brexit is going to disappoint people. You can package it up and say it's all going great, but it is having huge impact. It's reignited the conversation on independence in Scotland. It's potentially shown the divisions, the geographic divisions in England in a far more starker light, and exposed a lot of the fiscal differentials. Yeah. And then you look at Northern Ireland. Ultimately, if a hard border had have been put in place across our island, a lot of people would have been very annoyed. It would have caused huge damage. The element of a border east-west, it's not really a border, checks at 3 or 4 ports of entry, has been jumped on by some, and it was always going to be thus, because what some people saw from Brexit was never possible. And every time you told them it wasn't possible, they were like, oh, well, all that can be got around. And that's people in England more so, but certainly quite a number of Brexiteers in Northern Ireland were just in denial about what they were voting for or what they were not voting for, had very major consequences. And it shouldn't be surprising. And it's a very easy thing to point all concerns and ills and blame it on the protocol, when really what the heart of this is Brexit. It's socioeconomic neglect. It's a failure to provide real reconciliation. And some of that responsibility is shared by everyone. And I would have been quite critical of politicians in the South, but after the Good Friday Agreement, far too many of us disengaged from North-South relations. And we even saw it in our media. We went from Northern Ireland and events in Northern Ireland being on every news programme and in every newspaper with daily occurrence, rarely good news, to very rare pronouncements. Sometimes some of the reporting, you could argue, or some of the commentary was quite condescending. You know, every time Stormont collapsed or there was a standoff over something that perhaps we just don't understand. Some people in the South very much don't understand how exposed Gaeilgeoirs in Northern Ireland feel. Some people in the South don't appreciate the importance of marching a particular route means to people in the Orange institutions. And that's fine, but understanding isn't an excuse to ignore. You know, you have to develop that level of understanding, and Brexit brought all that back to the fore. And then the institutions collapsed again. And I think it forced politicians in particular in the South to spend a lot more time focused on what's happening in Northern Ireland. I just wish it hadn't taken Brexit to bring that about.
What do we think, you know, the lack of intergovernmental council meetings and things like that? I mean, that surely is extremely injurious in the present climate, because you would think that, you know, that every opportunity to build bridges and to develop understanding, to meet and talk and all of that should be grasped, and that isn't happening at the moment.
No, and like, you have to question why it's happening. And I can't answer the question. I know why the health minister in the Republic has been slow to meet Robin Swan in the last fortnight, and that's nothing political. You know, obviously we had a fairly serious cyber attack on our systems, and the plate is full. But ultimately, that excuse lasts so long. They do need to have a meeting, because coordination in terms of response to the pandemic, there hasn't been a coordinated response, and that's probably been to the detriment of people on this island in terms of keeping the virus out, or in terms of managing it. And that's in terms of the speed of the vaccine rollout in the South, just as much as the spikes before Christmas that saw a load of ambulances going up from the South to the North, or Letterkenny hospitals A&E being full, or whatever it is. But I just look at the last couple of months and the failure of DUP ministers to attend North-South Ministerial Council. It's just really disappointing, because being slightly removed from it, you can just see that this achieves nothing. And we've seen this throughout history in Northern Ireland in particular, but across this island. If you ignore a process, if you disengage a process, you're rarely going to get the result you want. And I just think there's been 2 agricultural ministers of the North-South Ministerial Council missed. How does any farmer and anywhere on this island benefit from the ministers not meeting, when so much of what we do is coordinated? At the end of the day, a cow will be milked in Fermanagh, and the milk will be processed in Cavan, and then the butter will be sold in London via Fermanagh. You know, all these things that are part of integrated system. You know, how many farmers buy livestock or feed across the border and they don't even blink an eye, but there are issues coming up that require a coordinated response. And that could be the UK negotiating a free trade deal with Australia, or changes coming up in terms of EU regulation on nitrates or phosphates or something like that. And seeing the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement be used as a sort of a political plaything is very disappointing. But it also then, you know, how do you fix that in a way that benefits everyone? It requires patience, it requires generosity, but it also requires the imagination to say, like, these are all opportunities. Why can't we look at the positives? And I was taken by Matthew O'Toole, the relatively new MLA in Belfast South, who's looked at the protocol. You know, he's put his Treasury official hat on and said, look, there are massive opportunities for Northern Irish businesses here. So why aren't we focusing on the opportunities rather than giving out about the difficulties or concerns or, you know, the emotional drain that don't occupy as much time? Because ultimately, if you can still do your shopping, if you can still do your business, east, west, north, south, the politics of it becomes a little bit moot. And certainly that's been my kind of, I take a very practical approach to politics. Where can we see the opportunities? Where can we see the positives? Where can we address the problems? And that requires the ability to put aside certain hang-ups going into any conversation. And certainly from a British government point of view, we have the British Irish Intergovernmental Conferences meeting next month, June, but they haven't met for 2 years. And you'd think over the last 2 years, there's been quite a lot to talk about between the Irish and British governments.
Yeah.
And they weren't going to be bilateral negotiations about Brexit, but just the practical things. And we look for the post-Brexit relationship. And you hear Brexit here saying we're going to make a success for this and let's unleash the potential and opportunities. Well, like, the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement present the greatest opportunities. Ireland can be the UK's best friend within the European Union. They can coordinate like Norway does with the other Nordic countries. Equally, on a north-south basis, Northern Ireland has unique opportunities that no other part of the United Kingdom has, and that equally that the Republic doesn't have either. So, you know, if you're being blunt about it, what does one achieve by staying away?
What you're describing there is kind of, you know, I mean, it's political, it's economic. I mean, the economic stuff makes kind of sense at a macro level and then a micro level. I'm just kind of thinking that while all of this standoff, deadlock plays out, there are fears as to what will happen on streets in the north in the very near future over the coming marching season. Are you worried about what the summer may hold for us?
I wouldn't use the term worried, but certainly concerned, and certainly alive to the potential of unrest. I would take a hope and a confidence that we've come so far as a collective on this island that it would never slip back to the really, really dark days that I remember reading about in newspapers and watching on the news as a child and hearing stories from my relations who lived in Balmahinch, or after my dad who would have come back from a business meeting or a rugby match. But I really get frustrated when people will say things knowing that it heightens concerns and fears. And there's a believed political merit or dividend to that. I would like to think that whenever I comment or whenever I provide an opinion, it is an attempt to be productive. Because the status quo in terms of ignoring people, boycotting, not participating, can't go on forever. And we look at the couple of nights and couple of weeks of rioting that happened before in Belfast and Coleraine and Derry, and like, it was really dispiriting and it was really sad, but the overwhelming response across the spectrum was one of disappointment and condemnation, varying degrees of condemnation. There's very few politicians out excusing or encouraging the behaviour, which is to be welcomed. And certainly when we approach the coming months, it doesn't help when you have a British minister saying, well, we need to fix the 12th of July as a deadline for agreement on something that isn't feasible. So I think we have to be careful what we're playing into, and we can't let it diminish continued efforts at practical discussions on resolving outstanding issues and the overall theme of reconciliation. because I just can't understand. I've lots of relations and friends who would consider themselves not just unionists, but loyalists. But at the heart of it, reconciliation is in everyone's interest, and it's in their interest too. It doesn't benefit them for us to be stoking up fears or trying to rerun battles of yesteryear. But they're all people who have interests, be they economic, social, of just getting along. And I think we can get back to that. And there's going to be lots of parallel conversations, but we can't let, be it the protocol or a potential border poll, spook what we have. You know, if we believe in the Good Friday Agreement and the opportunities it presents, we have to believe in all of the Good Friday Agreement.
Can I ask you one final question? I just wondering what you, this atypical politician from the former Free State, goes and says to these loyalist friends who are probably, you know, very, very worried, more than concerned, worried, maybe even frightened in some cases, that their identity is going to be eradicated, eliminated, going to disappear if Fine Gael United Ireland Party gets that long-term aspiration that it has held for, you know, throughout its existence. What do you say to reassure people who think that this is only moving in one direction and that'll happen to their detriment?
It doesn't have to be to their detriment, but first of all, we have to acknowledge their fears and acknowledge the feeling perhaps they feel threatened at the moment, and be considerate and compassionate and say, well, okay, well, what is your identity? You know, what defines your Britishness? How do we retain your Britishness? How does the protocol threaten your Britishness? You know, question that as well. Is it the right to religious freedom? Is it the ability to parade in July? You know, there's orange marches in Rossnowla every year. It's not. It's the most important thing is not to dismiss. So I believe in a united Ireland. I believe in that being a better place than what we have at the moment, either in the south or in the north. Does that mean we need free healthcare at the point of access? Does that mean we need a new constitution, guarantees for religious freedoms, all these sort of things? There's so many more discussions to have that are worth having. And I think it's funny when you put people together in a social arrangement and you take the politics out of it, whether we like it or not, we all share a common Irishness, Northern Irishness, Britishness that's very relatable, and it works very well in the positives. And I think one thing is, it's to repeat, look, we've no interest in taking over. We've no interest in removing your rights or anything like that. We'd love to have a conversation about how we could unite this country. And if you don't want to be part of that conversation, that's fine. But I do want to know right now what your concerns are. How do we address those concerns? And how do we work together better in a shared concept that brings out the best of what we all love about where we call home, regardless of what we call home.
Neale Richmond, it's been fascinating talking to you. Great to hear about your, as I say, atypical background for a politician getting involved in affairs in Northern Ireland, coming from the Republic and all that. And look forward maybe someday to seeing some of your relatives make it this far north, coming to see, you know, this amazing walled city of Derry, and maybe take them on a wee dander around the walls. Thanks indeed for joining us and for going on the record with your thoughts on the line on partition. Thanks for joining us.